Hello, my name is James, and today I will be talking about Sweden during World War II, its neutrality, its trade, and the army. And maybe this will explain a little bit what Sweden did during World War II and why. First of all, we need some background information. Up until 1809, Sweden and Finland was one country. Russia invaded, and 1809 Sweden lost the part of its territory that is present-day Finland. We always have close ties to Finland, and what Finland did during World War II would somewhat dictate what Sweden would do. Then we jump ahead until 1925, when Sweden saw that it was not really any military threat in Europe at that time. Soviet Union was weak, Germany was in chaos. We don't need a big army. Sweden has something called fördelning, which is equivalent to a division. We had 6 of those, and they eliminated 2 divisions. They eliminated also 19 regiments. And of the military personnel, or the personnel that could be trained for mandatory military service, they would only train 2/3 of the available population. And they would shorten the training time to 140 days. The budget that had been set in 1914 at the beginning of World War I was 182 million Swedish kronor. They reduced that down to 120 million kronor, and then again down to 107 million kronor. There was some forward thinking in this Defense Act. They set up a small tank force, and they made the Air Force a standalone service. The plan behind this Defense Act was that if war clouds starts hovering in Europe, we have time to rearm, which they didn't, but that was the plan with this Defense Act. 1936, now Hitler is rearming. Soviet Union is growing stronger, and Sweden decides we need to rearm also. So they raised the budget from 118 million Swedish kronor up to 148 million Swedish kronor, which doesn't sound that bad. But 148 million Swedish kronor in 1936 was about 1.5% of GDP, so it was a rather modest rearmament. The Air Force got most of the money, and with this money they tried to import planes from other countries like USA and the UK. But by the time those planes should be delivered, World War II would have broken out and no deliveries were made, or very few planes were delivered. Okay, so now it's 1939 and war has broken out. The Prime Minister of Sweden is Per Albin Hansson, who said our preparedness is good, but he was lying. The Air Force in that time had about 130 outdated planes. The most modern fighter plane we had was the Gloucester Gladiator biplane, which couldn't stand up to any modern fighter of the era. We had a few tanks, and some were not that bad, but we had very few. We had under 40 tanks in 1939. The most numerous tank was the M37. M37 is the production year of the tank. So every tank in Sweden will have a M and then a year, and the year is just when the tank was produced, and later after that year it will come into service. So the M37 was a tankette. It had 2 machine guns, and we had 48 of those ones. We had a tank called the M38, which was the only tank with a gun, a certain 7mm gun, and we had 16 of those. It's not really super bad tanks for the era, but very few. And we can check how Sweden did with its tank force during the war. So 39 we had about 40 tanks. In 43 we had about 500 tanks. And in 1945 we had reached about 800 tanks, which is a good sized number of tanks for a country in the size of Sweden. The problem with the tank force in 1945 was that it was a tank force more suited for 1940-41 than for 45. One of the most numerous tanks we had was the M41, which came into service 1943. It had a 37mm gun, and it was a variant of a Czech tank that the Germans used. The Germans called it 38T. So in the beginning of the war, that would have been a pretty okay tank, but by the end of the war, Germany didn't use it really anymore, and Sweden would have had a hard time fighting any heavy to medium tank of the era. So Sweden in 1945, tank-wise, could probably have put up a fight, but any determined enemy with enough tanks would have conquered Sweden still. We were about 5 years behind in the technology of tanks. The Air Force in 1939 was, as previously stated, not very effective. We had few planes and they were old. From 1943 we started to get some pretty good planes. Some were developed in Sweden, like the J-22, which it's a low-level fighter, and in test against the P-51 Mustang it could hold its own or even beat it. On higher altitudes it would have lost, but it was a pretty competent plane for its era. We also had to import planes, and the only country we really could import from after 1940 was from Italy, who sold us, among others, a Caproni bomber, which wasn't a super good plane. It was called the Flying Coffin in Sweden because it has a tendency to crash. Sweden's Air Force started growing after 43, and by 1945 we had about 800 planes. That was by far the strongest service in the Swedish Defense Force. Okay, so Sweden didn't join World War II, but Finland did pretty good against Soviet Union in 39. Why couldn't Sweden have done the same? Well, Finland did something amazing in 39 against Soviet Union, but they had one major advantage that Sweden did not have. For Soviet Union, there was only one point of entrance to invade Finland, and that was at the Karelian Isthmus. It's a small stretch of land with bodies of water on each side. And all attacking forces would be funneled into that point, because north of Lake Ladoga, there's not really many roads, and even though the Russians tried to invade that way, the Finnish forces used the forest, surrounded them, and eliminated the Soviet forces. Sweden, on the other side, we have about 2,400 kilometers of coastline. After 1940, the border with Norway would have been pretty wide open. We had some fortification, but if Germany decided to invade from that way, they would have succeeded. And the biggest mobilization Sweden did during the war was about 300,000 men. It went up and down a little bit depending on what was happening in the surrounding area. But 300,000 men, you can compare that to Poland. It's a little bit of halting comparison, but Poland mobilized 1 million men with something similar in equipment to Sweden, and they couldn't stand against Germany. The halting comparison between Poland and Sweden is that the geography is different. But the south of Sweden is perfect tank country. It's rolling hills, few forests. So the south of Sweden and Stockholm would have been conquered very quickly. Swedish forces could have put up a stand up north where it's more forest and less roads. But as we would have been surrounded by enemy countries who couldn't have got help from anywhere, and that would just have been a prolonged, a little bit longer fight before we were conquered totally. So why didn't Sweden join World War II? Well, because up until 1943 we would have been a walkover. We wouldn't have been able to put up much of a fight. The only outcome for from Sweden's perspective would have been occupation. The civilian population under the Nazi state, and the Swedish government tried to avoid that at all costs. And the fact that Sweden did not get invaded or join World War II made it a safe haven for people fleeing from Nazi oppression. So about 60,000 refugees from Norway came to Sweden, and almost all the Danish Jews escaped from Denmark in 43 when the Germans were about to round them up. The Danish resistance did something magnificent. They just smuggled out almost all the Jews from Denmark to Sweden. And lastly, one should know that we knew that Germany, or Sweden knew that Germany was a bad country and were persecuting Jews, but no one really knew how bad it really was. There was a Swedish photographer in 42, I think, working in Berlin, who managed to smuggle out a photo taken from one of the concentration camps showing execution of Jews. And as I've heard, that photo was later sent to the British in 43, so around 42, 43 at least, the government should have had a general idea what was happening. Okay, the next step is, why did Sweden trade so much with Germany? Well, we had no choice. For example, in 1939, the biggest trade Sweden had was with the Allies, where we exported about 32% of all our exports. And to Germany, we exported 22%. After 1940, when Denmark and Norway got occupied, we had no avenue of export out in the Atlantic. If you look at the map, Norway and Denmark closes in Sweden pretty well from the Atlantic Ocean. So in 1941, we managed only to export about 4% to the Allies, and 84% of our exports went to Germany. Sweden traded with the countries it could, which was Germany. We sold iron ore and got coal back, and coal was necessary for Sweden to survive. We didn't get oil like we needed, and coal was a staple of heating and industry and so on. They made some profit from this trade, there is no question about that. And there is an argument how long the iron ore from Sweden prolonged the war. But from a Swedish perspective, they did what they could in a bad situation for its own citizens. And one should remember that the Swedish export in the worst year shrank about 30 to 35% from the pre-war export. So it's not like the export just kept growing during World War II, it's actually shrank considerably. Still, we exported some to the Allies, and mostly it was ball bearings. They actually put up a clandestine airline between Sweden and the UK, using, among other planes, rebuilt Mosquito fighter bombers to transport ball bearings from Sweden to the UK. We, of course, also exported ball bearings to Germany. And in 1943, the US Air Force had bombed Schweinfurt, trying to eliminate the ball bearing industry of Germany. And they were obviously quite upset that Sweden still kept exporting ball bearings. So under pressure from USA, Sweden stopped its export of ball bearings to Germany. Now, the next question is, why did Sweden appease the Germans so much in the beginning of the war and the Allies in the end of the war? It's a pretty straightforward answer. After 1940, we didn't have a choice. Every country around Sweden was either occupied by Germany or allied with Germany. So if you have the biggest, strongest power in Europe surrounding you, and you're a small neutral country, there is not so much you can do. In hindsight, you can say it's not very likely that the Germans would have invaded Sweden, but if Sweden would have stopped the iron ore export, I'm pretty sure that Germany would have. They invaded Norway for that very reason, to keep the export of iron going. But Sweden couldn't really know what Germany would do, even though after the invasion of Norway, the Germans demanded to use the telegraph lines from Norway going through Sweden down to Denmark, and Sweden agreed. Because we were secretly listening to those wires, and a very brilliant man called Arne Börling cracked the German secret encryption machine called the T-52 Geheimschreiber. He did that in 2 weeks with pen and paper, and he never told anyone how he did it. Some say that this machine was actually harder to crack than the Enigma machine. I'm not sure about that, but it was a pretty great achievement. So until 43 we could read pretty much of the traffic between Norway and Denmark from the German forces, but bad security made the Germans get wind of this, and after 43, 44 they changed their encryption technology and we couldn't crack it. Anyway, 1941. Here comes the first real crisis. It's called the Midsommar Crisis. And after Germany invaded Soviet Union the same day, they marched up to the Swedish foreign minister and said, we want to transport a fully equipped division on Swedish railways to Finland. And if you don't allow this, it won't only be seen unkindly, it will be seen as very unfriendly to the German cause. So Swedish government took 4 days to discuss if they should do this or not. The king was in favor of the transit of this division. And they finally agreed. And probably one of the biggest reasons why they agreed was that the division was going to Finland. And Sweden didn't want to look like we were not helping Finland when we could. Germany came later that year and wanted to transport another division, and then Sweden said no, and Germany didn't push that matter. So we didn't always do what the Germans told us, but at some point you had to. So Germany transported about 2 million soldiers on the Swedish railways. That could be soldiers on leave, but they also transported war materials. In 43 we ended, or the Swedish government ended this agreement for the Germans to use the Swedish railways, because the Swedish army had started to grow stronger and the Germans' warlike was in decline and the Allies was just about to turn the table on them. So we had a stronger position for the negotiation. So after 1943, we started acting a little bit more in the Allies' cause. We shared some intelligence with them. And the reason is probably not because the Allies was the stronger power, not in the Swedish close regional area anyway. We bow down to USA with the ball bearings, that's for sure. So USA threatened to bomb Swedish factories if we didn't do that. But the reason we did more for the Allies later is that the general opinion in Sweden was pro-Allied much more than pro-German. And in hindsight, you could say we could have put up a more of a fight. But in 1940, 41, 42, you could, at that moment, you couldn't really know what the Germans would do. So it's not really that easy to say that we should have done even more. I think Sweden did what it could in a bad situation. So a conclusion here. If Sweden would have joined World War II, they would, especially in the beginning of the war, we would have been conquered very quickly. It would have been the same time frame as for Norway. And maybe that would have been morally good to do to join the Allies, but from a Swedish perspective, to keep its citizens as safe as possible, I think the government did pretty well. Some good things were done and some bad ones. We helped the Danish Jews, the 8,000 that was smuggled out of Denmark in 43. And the bad thing is we made money from Nazi Germany. Had Sweden been conquered, we would have our quislings just like Norway, and one of them would have been Ingvar Kamprad of IKEA fame. He was actually part of the Nazi movement in the 30s, and he kept ties with that movement up until the 1950s. There were some in favor of joining Germany, but that was never the general opinion. And that can maybe be seen in the way that how many Swedes fought for Germany. I think it's estimated about 180 Swedes volunteered to fight with the German army. And some were actually in favor of not bowing down to Hitler at all. Per Edvin Sköld was a social democrat during the Midsommar Crisis. And his point of view was that we shouldn't bend down for violence and we should rather get occupied. A very moral standpoint, but for the people of Sweden, it would have been a disaster if Germany would have invaded, as can be seen in many other countries. Sweden played both sides of the fence, but as I see it, they didn't have much choice. They made money from their export, but it's maybe worse to consider that the exports from 39 to the worst years of the war shrank with 35%. So it wasn't like Sweden just kept exporting more and more and more. It was actually a shrinking export market, and Sweden is an export-dependent country. So some good things were done and some bad things, but for a small neutral country in World War II, I think they managed pretty well to navigate the treacherous water of World War II politics. One could have done more, but on the other side, one thinks, how much more could a small neutral country do? So the good things we did was we sent white buses during when the war was still ongoing to rescue people from concentration camps, mostly Scandinavian citizens, but some other also. Raoul Wallenberg helped to save Jews in Budapest. The bad thing is we accepted gold as payment from the Nazis. And in best case scenario, that gold was simply looted from banks in the different conquered countries. In the worst case scenario, that was actually gold from Jews being killed in concentration camps. But Sweden was a small country and it made do. So that was JMS. Thank you for listening and see you later.